Well, good afternoon, good evening, or good morning, depending on where you are in this world, and welcome to today's DevOps.com webinar. I'm Charlene O'Hanlon, moderator for today's event, and I welcome you. Before we get started with today's webinar, I do have a few housekeeping items I need to go over. First of all, today's event is being recorded, so if you miss any or all of the event, you'll be receiving a link to the event post-event, and that will take you to the webinar on demand. You could listen to it then. And we are taking audience questions. So if at any time during the webinar you have a question for any of our panelists, just use your control panel, submit your question. We'll take probably about 10 or 15 minutes near the end of the webinar and go through those questions. Okay, with that, we'll go ahead and get started with the webinar. Innovate everywhere, choosing the right tools when building your SRE toolchain. Our speakers today are Margot Shadell, who is developer advocate at InfluxData, Jason Hand, DevOps champion and advisor to VictorOps, and Leonard Grem, core developer at Grafana Labs. Welcome, everybody. Thanks for being here today.
Thank you, and thanks
Great.
to DevOps.com.
Oh, thank you. Jason, I know you're going to be driving the slides, so I'm going to go ahead and turn it on over to you.
Yeah, I'm going to take it from here. So appreciate it, and yeah, thank you to my friends Margot and Leonard for joining and doing this this presentation with us. I think hopefully it's going to be very helpful for a lot of people. And if you've got any questions, feel free to drop those in or save them till the end. We'll definitely get to as many as we can. So with that said, let's kind of jump into what we're hoping to share with you today and some of the things that we hope you kind of take away. The first one is that we're going to go over just a little bit about how some of the expectations have sort of shifted and changed in terms of reliability and availability, sort of within our industry, within the web operations space, the IT management space, and SaaS and all kinds of different areas that are trying to move in a more modern way. They have these new challenges that kind of come with trying to maintain uptime and maintain healthy services that are always growing and getting better, but also being very reliable and available. So we'll talk about those challenges. And then we're also going to discuss a little bit about how you can create some really lightweight representations of your systems to really have this better sense of understanding of the health of your system and the health of your business. It's not just about system performance. It's not just about host metrics and that kind of thing. It's really about being able to have greater observability on really not just the service that you're providing and the applications you're building, but also the business as well. So we'll talk about how you can kind of create some really interesting visualizations and representations of that kind of stuff. And then last, we'll go through each of the tools that we've got discussed out here today from InfluxData, Grafana, and VictorOps, and kind of show you how we can kind of piece together a little bit of an SRE-like tool chain where we can kind of monitor some different things, show what is going on within certain aspects of our system, and then set up some triggers and alarms to make sure that we're humanely reaching out to the humans who are going to have to respond to the incident. And then during that time, we'll also kind of dive in a little bit more about what we mean by an incident and actually the full life cycle of that incident. There's 5 different phases of an incident. But I wanted to start off kind of this story with this comment from my CTO at VictorOps, and I think he's absolutely right that people do rely on VictorOps extremely heavily. I mean, they come to us to let them know that they're down and we are the ones that sort of help them remediate that. So reliability is a big deal to VictorOps. But probably just like your company and lots of others, reliability is becoming more and more important to you as well as you try to deliver services online and build applications, whether that's mobile or web. People start to use these services and they start to become very reliant on them and their ability to be up and serving their needs, creating value for them pretty much any day and any night. So when we talk about reliability and availability, what exactly are we sort of diving into here? Well, like I mentioned, most businesses these days, they're starting to realize that they're not just maybe a brick and mortar retail store or something along those lines, or a restaurant. They really have to start exploring with new technology and new capabilities to deliver value to the customer. If you think about some of the pizza chains out there, if it wasn't for the technology that's been developed to allow companies like Papa John's to start allowing people to order pizzas online or through mobile applications, these other companies now are starting to realize they need to do the same thing just to compete and just to sort of stay relevant in their market. And that's going on across every industry. There's just a lot of challenges that companies and businesses have to sort of start looking at. And a lot of it comes back to being able to provide services that are always up and available. And some of this is coming because of technology and just sort of the shifting in our industry. A lot of new things like containerization. We're talking about how to orchestrate those types of things now. There's a lot of new tech that has really sort of evolved here with the cloud and you know, all kinds of new ideas in terms of agile and DevOps and lean. There's just been a really kind of surgence of new ideas that has really shifted the way we build and deliver and maintain those services. And what's coming along with that is this complexity. And the complexity is the stuff that's really starting to make us or force us to rethink the way we pay attention to our systems, we pay attention to the health of our business, and we make sure that when something is wrong, it's really wrong, and we only reach out to people in an actionable way. But as our systems become more and more distributed and complex, this is causing all kinds of sort of, I guess, disturbances in the ways that we used to sort of previously approach system uptime. And so that kind of pushes us into this whole DevOps conversation through things like continuous delivery and talking about automating more and more and trying to get more monitoring on things. DevOps has really been one of the kind of factors in this shift that we see in our industry and all of the changes that are starting to come along with it. And so I'm sure that everybody's very familiar with DevOps. Of course, we're here at DevOps.com today doing this webinar, but you're probably also starting to hear a little bit more about SRE and site reliability. And you'll inevitably run into someone who asks the question, are these the same thing? Because from certain angles and certain conversations, they seem like they're trying to solve for the same thing. And so there's always been a little bit of debate of what are the two distinctions between the two. So I thought I'd share with you something that I found online and thought that was very helpful from our friends over at Google. They actually had a nice little video and a nice little write-up here that kind of describes some of the core principles of both sort of practices or both principles. And I'm going to show you how those kind of align with each other. So the first one, obviously, you hear it all the time. We want to get rid of silos within sort of a DevOps mindset. We want to get all of our different organizations. Of course, it started with developers and operations teams. Let's get them working together and reduce these silos. But it's really expanded to the entire business. Let's make sure that we don't have these artificial sort of barriers around our teams that they can't collaborate and start to solve and innovate together. So get rid of those silos. The next thing DevOps sets out to do is really break things down into smaller, more manageable sort of release cycles, and so that we can implement change into our system in a much more gradual way. That way, when something inevitably goes wrong in our complex systems, we have a much smaller footprint to kind of go investigate what's happened. The changes are much smaller. So that's something else we encourage through sort of the DevOps mindset as well. The one that I talk about all the time is the fact that within these systems, because they are complex systems, there is going to be failure, and that's just normal. That's just part of the system. We can't really prevent it. There are things that we can do to sort of look for it on the front end and maybe mitigate the outcome of some sort of failure, but failure as a whole is just going to be always part of a complex system. So we have to accept this and sort of bias our intentions and the things that we want to do to address failure in a really different way than previous sort of software engineering had approached it. The next part is that we use all these awesome tech, these tools that are coming out to allow us to really automate much more of the entire delivery process. And what that does is it removes all the monotony, it removes all the opportunities for errors, and it really allows engineers to kind of focus on the next problem, the next thing, the next whatever we need to do to be able to make our system both more reliable and available, but also continuously improving. And then you'll also hear that within DevOps, it's very important to just measure as much as possible. Now, I would say maybe not measure literally everything, but the point is that you want to have some sort of observability onto the things that are important to the business, the things that are important to the end user and the value that we're trying to get to them. And then as well as let's measure some of the hard system metrics and the things that are going on more at the core of our sort of our service. Now, if we flip it around, we start kind of going into what SRE, Site Reliability Engineering, is set out to do. The first thing is that it's trying to create more of a shared ownership between the developers and the tools and the techniques that are kind of used across the stack. And so you start to see where we are, again, breaking down a little bit of silos. Let's get people on the same page about what we're doing, how we're doing it, what those techniques and tools are, and really make sure that as we move along, continuously improving, we're doing it as a group. So let's get rid of some of those barriers by really kind of creating more ownership across the entire org. We also want to start creating a formula for balancing these accidents with new releases. Whenever something goes wrong, there's a new deployment, maybe there's going to be a problem right after that. Again, kind of going back to the fact that there's going to be failure, we now have different ways that we can balance those failures. When we deploy, we kind of are ready for it because we're doing it so often now. We have high confidence in what we're looking for and how we can address those problems as they come up. The next one is that we encourage to moving quickly by reducing the cost of failure. This also kind of ties back into just accepting that failure is normal, and we need to address different ways of approaching that sort of a reality of our system. So we really want to encourage moving quickly, and so this kind of a swarm mentality to problems rather than the old school traditional methods of maybe escalating through a ticket or going through some sort of knock. We have to take a little bit different approach on how we address failure. And then encouraging automating this year's job away, that's really kind of speaks to the automation part of DevOps. What we do today, once we figure that out and we've been able to kind of identify the steps in very logical order, we can then script that. And once we've safely scripted a lot of the work that is very monotonous, we need to sort of allow those automation tools to take over on that, and then let us work on the new problems and the new challenges. And then last here, they believe that operations is a software problem. And a lot of this has to do with just sort of the emergence of lots of different tech and tools that allow us to really instantiate and create instances by writing code and using scripts to go out and leverage APIs with cloud providers and get whatever infrastructure we need. So a lot of the operations sort of efforts are now being shifted over into practices that look and smell and feel very much like kind of traditional software development. So there's a little bit of a shift there as well. And you can kind of see how these all tie together between the silos and getting people to share ownership, and all the way down to the very beginning where we have to start looking at, or I'm sorry, down at the very end, where we have to start looking at the operations as software, and we can now start kind of measuring our operations and our systems, the uptime and different outage kind of numbers. And those are important in terms of the observability about our system. And so when it comes to site reliability, you can see there's a lot of commonality between DevOps and really what we're trying to accomplish here. And one thing that I always like to point out, because I hear this all the time when people are having discussions about, well, how do you kind of implement DevOps, or how do you get SRE started? One thing that we took, one approach I guess we took at VictorOps is to be very explicit that we do not want to create another group or another team that is solely responsible for the reliability of our service. We really needed it and wanted it to be more of a cultural change and a cultural ownership of the entire sort of concern about our reliability and our availability. So of course, a lot of it falls onto the subject matter experts, the people who are trained and know these things. But the truth is, reliability is something that falls on my shoulders as an employee of VictorOps, and even people in different areas of the organization. We all have to have this sort of mentality of changing the way we do things in order to be more agile, to be more sort of DevOps minded, and really increase our chances of having good, reliable systems. And a lot of that came from us, or for us came from asking a ton of questions. When it comes to observability, that's really just sort of, there's a lot of confusion on what is the difference between observability and monitoring. And monitoring is really something you do on a system. A system is either observable or not. And so we want it to be much more observable, and the way to do that is to start asking questions. You have to be able to really dig into your system and ask it anything you want and get some sort of reasonable answer that you have confidence in. And the point of that is that we're trying to reduce the unknown unknowns in our systems. These are properties of every complex system. There's all kinds of things that we would never really stumble upon that are serious problems unless we proactively probe and try to uncover those things. And that's a big part of what SRE is set out to do, is we want to put in some different techniques and different tooling to expose more areas of the system so that we have a better understanding of what's real and what is the reality of the system. And then we can make smart, educated decisions from there. So again, kind of when everybody asks, what's the best way to get your SRE journey started, I inevitably always come back to what keeps you up at night. This is the first question that we asked ourselves at VictorOps, and you ask the business owners, you ask the founders and the owners of the company, you ask the heads of the departments, and you ask the engineering team, you ask everyone, what keeps you up at night about your service? And you'll get lots of different responses and lots of different ideas, and immediately you start to realize, wow, these are important questions. I do want to know this specific thing about our business or this specific thing about our system. And then you start figuring out, how can we get observability into those questions? How can we actually answer those questions? We have to start going out and collecting data and collecting metrics and logs and traces and all these different things that really start to allow us to ask those questions. But one thing that you have to keep in mind is that the data on its surface by itself is going to mean different things to different people. So even as you're collecting it, you kind of have to keep in mind, who is this data going to be served for, and what is it going to be used for? Because it's going to have different meanings for different people. So keep that in mind, because when we start to talk about paging people and alerting people, you want it to be actionable, and you want to make sure that the information you're delivering them makes sense to them and it's what they need in that moment. So another thing that I kind of think is important to point out is, you'll hear all the time, whether it's DevOps or SRE, that this is really a journey. There is no prescribed way to do this. It's different for everyone. But one thing that we see a lot is that the tools that SREs use at any given time are going to depend on where they are in that journey. So very early on, you may see companies and organizations and teams who have very specialized operations tools. Maybe something that they've built themselves initially, but then they've went on and they've maybe purchased some other vendor, but they're using things that are very specialized. And then as they sort of move along in their journey, you start to see more of a convergence between SRE and then sort of the traditional software engineering tool chains. You start to see that kind of overlap where we're sharing and sort of owning together the tool chain and how you use these tools to develop software, deliver it, and then also keep it running as much as you can. So to kind of like come back around to this whole thing, again, how do we do DevOps? Well, it really just depends. And the same thing applies to SRE. Everyone's story is a little bit different. Well, that's kind of frustrating to hear, of course, but the good news is we can at least give you some examples. And that's kind of the best, that's the best way to learn, is to see what are other people doing? How are they solving problems? And how does that relate to what I'm doing? So we're going to go through just a little bit of an SRE kind of tool chain scenario here. And I'm going to let Leonard take over from here and kind of transition into this little story, fictional story, that'll kind of set us up for the latter part of this presentation, where we actually piece together some real tools and show you how it works. So I'm going to hand it over to you, Leonard. I'll drive from this end. Just let me know when you're ready to switch slides.
Thank you, Jason. Hello, guys. So let me tell you a little bit about this development team. We have this fictional development team. They've been at it for a long time. Maybe they've been developing a certain product, some web service for 2 years or more, and they really know their web service. But the organization they're part of has decided to go along more of a DevOps route. The old ops team becomes an infra team and are no longer kind of responsible for deploys. They're more in control of the environment itself and making sure it's up and running. And developers are suddenly called in to make deployments and be on call for the service and make sure that the service is actually up reliably. And this is quite a change. And it requires you to kind of learn a few different things. And as it turns out, if we can look at the next slide, they kind of come onto a little bit of a problem where the users contact support about the service being fairly unreliable. And obviously, this is not what you as a developer would like to hear as an organization at all. I mean, generally, you would like the system to be self-healing, or at least you would like to know from your alarm systems that there are problems and before they kind of really affect your customers enough that they go to support and contact you. But I mean, don't let us kid ourselves. This is more common than we like to believe, and especially if you're kind of new to the whole ops thing, it's quite common that you don't have enough alarms set up and that you aren't actually looking at the right things. But thankfully, the old ops team had actually set up a few tools and dashboards and things for them. So there were telegraf and influxDB for kind of collecting metrics and making sure that they had these metrics available. There were Grafana with some basic dashboards so they could look at the requests coming into their system and even they even had VictorOps for alarms and incident management. But unfortunately, they didn't seem to have alarms set up for this specific case that happened. And as the story continues on the next slide, we realize the team realizes that looking at these dashboards, that they actually had an increase in requests to their system, but they couldn't really find an increase in business metrics. So what this means is that while the request for the system went up, there were no extra purchases, there were no extra logins or things like that. And the team, being fairly used to debugging failed unit tests, were not as familiar with how to debug a running production system. So they were a bit dumbfounded and lost. But thankfully, the old ops team had some advice for them. So looking at the next slide, someone from the ops team mentioned the red method. And the red method is something that's really good if you have a request-based system. It's kind of a guide for how to monitor the general overview of a request-based system, and something you can use. And the red method refers to requests, errors, and durations. So the first thing they kind of you look at is request rate. How many requests are coming into my system at any given time? And that tells you a lot about the kind of visitors you have, and also, for example, if one of your load balancers are down, you will obviously see a drop in requests, or maybe an increase in requests on other systems. So it can tell you, depending on where you have the metrics and monitoring, you can actually tell you a lot of different things. But also, you have to track errors, which is the second letter in red method. And when you track errors, you can actually start looking at error rates. You can see that maybe you have a 20% error rate among all the requests right now. So you can actually set levels and understand that, well, over a certain error rate, we have more problems than the system can handle. And obviously, if you've gone up to a 100% error rate, something is terribly wrong. That's usually the case for a 0% error rate as well. As anyone who's worked in IT knows, that if we don't have any errors, the IT systems are probably not working or might not even be running. The last thing they want to look at is duration. How long does each request take? So you look at the average duration, and that might be something like 10 milliseconds or 50 milliseconds, depending on what kind of system you have and where your customers are. But you also look at the P90 and so on, so you can actually get a grip of understanding kind of the edge cases. Do we have requests that takes 30 seconds or something like that? I mean, that's obviously a big problem. And on the next slide, when the team started tracking these kind of things, they found out that the error rate was actually quite high. It was closing in on 50%. And the request duration was also really high overall. And that led them to look at kind of the web server logs. And they after a while found that the requests weren't really, from the client side, weren't really properly terminated on the server side, and requests were timing out without the server actually closing down the sockets, so they'd run out of sockets and so on. The details aren't that important, but basically by using these kind of generic metrics and generic monitoring, they found where they wanted to look, in what kind of system they wanted to look for errors, and in the logs they kind of found the problems. So if we go to the next slide, we get to see a bit of an example what their monitoring system and system could have looked like. They would have had, in this case, telegraf for collecting information from CPU memory and so on. Telegraf would send that to influxDB that stored the data and made it queryable. And then Grafana for dashboarding and alerting to both make it so that they could actually kind of get the information up on the wall on the TV and be aware of what's going on, but also for them to kind of set limits and make sure that if something goes wrong in the future, request error rate goes over a certain level, or maybe duration is very high, I mean, then they can send an alarm to VictorOps, and the right team can get the alarm based on what kind of error it is. That's all from me for right now, but let me hand over to Margot, who's going to talk a bit about their end of InfluxData's end of the whole toolchain.
Thanks, Leonard. So as Leonard said, I'm going to talk a little bit about InfluxData, but before we dive into all that, I just want to begin by reiterating a little of what both Jason and Leonard have been saying, that we believe that in order to have a successful DevOps cycle, you really need to ensure that everyone participating in that cycle has a responsibility for performance and a great user experience. So it's not enough to place the burden of performance management just on the shoulders of the SRE team. You need the people that are writing the code and the builders. They also need to be collecting and reviewing metrics to lessen any chance of performance issues in production. So that's kind of our focus here at InfluxData. We've aligned with this view, and that's how we've built our platform. So we've built it with the developers and builders in mind. We really want to make things simple for them, and we want to make sure our software is really easy to use so that everyone can use it and deploy it. So then on the next slide, we're going to jump into InfluxData. So here you can see InfluxData is a platform to pull all kinds of metrics and events. We don't really just handle system metrics for monitoring, although that is a common use case. We can actually handle all kinds of metrics. So you can see here on the left-hand side, there's a wide breadth of metrics. We have Internet of Things metrics, server-side and infrastructure metrics, as well as application performance metrics and business metrics. So those are just some examples. And this is because the platform caters to time series data. So there are a variety of use cases for it. We see people using the platform for things like monitoring their servers and applications, structured logging and tracing, and even machine learning and forecasting. So you can see there's a lot you can do here, and it's pretty easy to extract value from your data really quickly. So on the next slide, we're going to jump into talking about Telegraf and InfluxDB. But I just want to say that the InfluxData platform, it actually has 4 open source projects that we're working on. But today we're just going to focus particularly on 2 of the open source projects that are really well suited to be used in conjunction with Grafana and VictorOps. So Telegraf is our open source data collection agent, and InfluxDB is our time series data store. And if we can move to the next slide, we'll talk a little bit about Telegraf. So let's take a look at Telegraf first. As I said before, Telegraf is our open source data collecting agent. It's a completely plugin driven server agent to collect and report metrics. Right now we have a set of approximately 150 plugins, and we have more being written every day. And that's a mix of input and output plugins, aggregators and parsers, among other ones. The input plugins can source a variety of metrics directly from the system it's running on. They can pull metrics from third-party APIs, or they can listen for metrics via StatsD or Kafka consumer services. And one of the great things about Telegraf is it's so lightweight, so you can really just drop it anywhere and start collecting metrics right away. We also have output plugins so that you can send data to not only InfluxDB, but also other data stores or services or onto message queues. One of the great things about Telegraf is how community driven it is. As I said, we have about 150 plugins right now, but the Influx team really wrote maybe the first 6 plugins to get things rolling, and our community has completely taken over the rest. And then I want to note just finally that you don't have to necessarily use Telegraf to use InfluxDB. You can always send the data directly into Influx through the HTTP API, for example, or by using any number of our client libraries. But I'll talk a little bit more about this on the next slide. So what is InfluxDB? So InfluxDB is the first open source project of the InfluxData platform. It is a purpose-built time series database, and it's specifically designed to handle high write and query loads. As I covered in one of the earlier slides, InfluxDB handles time series data or time-stamped data. So we can see it being used in a variety of cases, like in infrastructure monitoring, IoT sensor data, real-time analytics, and application metrics. And the database comes with features designed to keep it lightweight, so you can conserve disk space by defining, say, how long you want to keep your data or having it automatically expire after a certain amount of time. That's available through our retention policy feature. You can also downsample your data to keep snapshots of it for a longer amount of time, but just at a lesser granularity. And then we have our query language is really SQL-like, so that you can interact with the database. And then also, as I said earlier, you can actually send the data directly into InfluxDB without using telegraf, using the HTTP API, or you can use any number of the client libraries available. They're available in like Node, Ruby, Python, and Go, for example. And then lastly, InfluxDB works really well with a number of other tools, which Leonard is actually going to talk about. You can pull out the data and create dashboards in Grafana to be able to visualize everything. So I'm actually going to pass the mic back over to Leonard, who's going to talk to you a little bit about Grafana.
Thank you, Mario. Right. So Grafana is one of an open source platform for beautiful analytics and monitoring. And as you can see on the right-hand side, it's possible to kind of create some fairly pretty graphs that show off your information and probably are useful as well at the same time. We also support a lot of different data sources, which means that you have your data in some of the more popular system or even some of the more obscure ones. You're probably pretty likely to be able to get that data out of that system and get it in Grafana and then make it so that you can look at and graph on that information together with information from one of your other data sources. So if you had an old Graphite installation, for example, and now you set up InfluxDB or Prometheus, you can get all of those systems, all data from all of those systems together on the same dashboard as it relates to each other and create it as you want to. So Grafana itself doesn't really care about what kind of data it is, as long as it's time series data. So you could do anything from CPU memory monitoring for servers, or maybe how much power a nuclear power plant is producing. It doesn't really matter. Grafana doesn't really care. We have a lot of different units that you can use to kind of spice up your graphs and make it a bit more understandable. Also, if you're curious about Grafana and you're not quite ready to install it, you can just go to play.grafana.org, which is our playground project, where you can see different dashboards that we have created and also play around with them yourself. So other than that, let's talk a little bit about time series. I mentioned time series were basically what Grafana is focused around, and time series are something that's actually everywhere. So what's the time series, you may ask? Well, it's basically a bunch of data points with timestamps tied to them. So here, for example, we can see the temperature graph for August, and that's basically just different highs and lows of temperature from different days of August. So any kind of data that you have like that, you can graph or put in a table, as we see on the left-hand side in Grafana, and that's kind of makes it very powerful. And on the next slide, we're going to look at how to actually create our first dashboard. So if you have Grafana installed, you just go to the plus sign up on the left-hand side and you click Create Dashboard. And you kind of get your first new dashboard, and then you get your own panel to start editing as well. And as you saw in the middle of here, as I demoed as well, you can actually kind of rearrange and resize your graphs as well very freely, which means you can create these kind of fluid dashboards however you want them to look. But of course, that's not really everything. We need to do a little bit more for it to be really interesting. So on the next slide, let's look about how to add some data. Here we add CPU information, usage, idle information right here from Influx. So the name was CPU mean, that's the metric name. We can easily alias that and just rename it to idle to make it a little bit easier to understand. And we can also add another metric, can add CPU usage from the user, for example, to kind of see, we see the idle and we see what's actually going on in the system, and then rename that as well. And as we can see here, that shows up in the graph. And there's a lot of different knobs we can kind of poke here and different settings we can make, but that's how easy it is to just go in, and after you've added your data source, which you can figure that out for yourself. Then you can just start adding your data and playing it around with it. And as you can see as well, we have editors here for InfluxDB, and we actually have editors for queries for a lot of different data sources, which means that even if you're not intimately familiar with the data source, you can still kind of play around with the data in Grafana and work with it. So that's something we're working on a lot as well. We kind of want to make Grafana as kind of easy to use as possible. You shouldn't need to be a pro at Grafana to be able to get started and start using it. And you shouldn't need to be a developer and ops person either. I mean, if you have business data, why not have the business people come in and create their own dashboards as well? So, but now we've done the kind of graphing and adding some metrics, and let's go over to alerting. So Grafana has kind of basic alerting features where you can add levels that you want to alert on. So here we add a level at 50, where if query A is over 50 for a minute, it's going to send an alarm, in this case to VictorOps notify on call. So we have a hook into VictorOps. We have a lot of different hooks as well. So this means that at any graph you create, you can actually go in and tie alarms to them as well, and kind of reason about the data. And what we could have done here that I didn't do in this example is you can actually kind of resize the window of time and look at a longer period of time, and maybe you see that while it makes sense to set the alarm at a certain level, maybe 150 or something, we see the spike there. For this short time period, you start looking at a 2-week time period, maybe we see that each Saturday at 8 p.m. it's going to go over that level. So yeah, in that case, it's probably not a good idea to have the alarm right there. Right. So there's a few more things, and then the final thing I want to talk about right now for Grafana is annotations. So we have all these kind of beautiful graphs that tell us a lot about our systems. But there's obviously metadata to any system, and in this case, we can actually add that in Grafana, and we can, for example, click a certain point in the graph and add an annotation. So in this case, we added for a deploy, and this could be done automatically from a system that supports this kind of tagging information instead, so that every time you do a deploy, you get a line in all your graphs for that system, and now you kind of know that, yeah, so this kind of peak that we had here, that correlates very, very closely to the deploy that we had. So they might be, there's quite a fair chance that they're actually related, and we should probably start looking into that. Or maybe it was entirely expected. Maybe you've added a lot of heavy operations to your system, and that's what you're expecting to see. And as we see as well, we can also just mark a region and have that as an annotation as well, and you can do that for whatever annotation data you have. In this case, maybe as a way to kind of ask others in the team and make sure that they know that there's something weird going on here and you want to look at it. So as you can see here, there's a lot of different things we can do with Grafana, and if we move to the next slide, we see some other examples of visualizing your data using Grafana. So we have a world map plugin, so you can kind of track your different logins or purchases, whatever kind of information you have from different parts of the world, and show that on your graph in Grafana. We have the Sabix plugin, which means you have a lot of, can show data from that system, and there's a lot of different kind of settings you can do, so you can kind of work with the data and use different kind of panels and different configurations to kind of make it the information that you think is important as visible as possible. And on top of that, Grafana is not only made to run on your computer, but it also is made so that it should be very easy to kind of put it on a permanent display, put it up on a TV, on a wall. And one thing that I found when you do that is that you will start to kind of recognize the data on that TV. So maybe you take a peek at that TV every time you go and fetch coffee, or every time you come in the morning, and soon after a few days or weeks, you're going to be able, with just a glance of an eye, to kind of recognize when something is strange in that graph. And that might trigger you to go into the system and kind of look and maybe find something that's wrong, or something that's good. Maybe there's a big sale and something is happening somewhere in the country that makes it so that things are going differently in your systems right now, and you get curious and things happen. And also, when you kind of do this and make these pretty graphs, it's actually fairly common that not only people in your team, but other people, maybe your product owner or someone from marketing, kind of comes by and look at this information and gets curious as well. So this tends, putting this information out in the open in a nice way that kind of everyone can understand, can actually have the effect of sparking conversations that would maybe never have happened usually. And I found at a previous job where I found myself having conversations with our product owner and someone from sales that I never thought I would have had with them. And previously we've had a really hard time having these conversations because we couldn't really we didn't understand the system in the same way, and all of a sudden we did. Well, that's everything from me. I'm going to hand over to Jason to kind of talk about their end of things.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Leonard, and thank you, Margot, for the Influx information. I appreciate you both being on this this presentation. It's been fun working on it together. But yeah, I think, you know, kind of what I want to reiterate again what Leonard was just talking about there, about having this information visualized and sort of available in general areas within an organization or within a team, and some of the byproduct wins that come out of that scenario when suddenly you visualize the system and the health of the system and the health of the business. Everyone starts to share the same context on what's normal and what's good and what's bad, and people start to ask more questions. And if you go back to what I said at the very beginning, this observability stuff just comes down to the ability to ask questions. And sometimes you don't even know what questions to ask, but just exposing more of different ways of showing information relevant to the value that your service is trying to provide will get so many interesting conversations kicked off that really can innovate your team and your technology, but also just do a lot of those things that we kind of showed you at the beginning about how DevOps and SRE are, you know, kind of not really one and the same, but share a lot of stuff. And the very first one is getting rid of those organizational silos and getting teams to really come together and try to own things together. And whenever you start to visualize your system and create these, you know, even if they're just basic representations of what's going on with your service and the value that you're delivering and how your business is actually doing, you won't believe the conversations that start to happen and how all these silos just start to kind of naturally dissolve. But you know, there's still the next part of it. Once, you know, we use something like Grafana to alert somebody or something that something's wrong, in most cases that's going still to a human being, that's going to a person. And that's kind of the VictorOps side of this whole story, is that once there's been some sort of an anomaly or just a thing that we believe is actionable and some person needs to do something about it, do you have something in place? Like what's your plan for this? And so if we move to the next slide here, one of the things that we advocate at VictorOps is that you take a very humane response to the human response of system disruptions and service outages and all these different things, because as people, we are, you know, we have lots of different, I guess, quirks and problems. We have cognitive bias that we have to deal with, and if we're put under loads of stress for extended periods of time, we tend to burn out very quickly. And if we're not really, you know, set up for success in terms of learning new things about our system and encouraged to ask genuine, honest questions about what's going on with how we build, deliver, and maintain those services, you really can't have a humane on-call experience. And so you really have to start looking at it and phasing and framing it through what's it like to be a person on call. And another thing that we kind of like to bring up a lot that really helps, I think, again, frame the context of incidents and what it's like for a person to deal with it, deal with any incident or a series of incidents, is that you have to understand what's actually taking place throughout the whole thing. And so on the onset, kind of at the beginning of this whole presentation, we showed you how we've got a collector and we've got things going into a time series database, and then it's being visualized and alerted on. That's a lot, kind of the early phase of the incident, where it's the detection aspect. We've got some things in place to let us know when something seems a little bit off. But once we know that, something is definitely wrong, this is an actionable alert, now you're moving on to the next phase of the incident where there are actually people responding. And it's very important that we use the word respond here rather than react. And I'll talk more about that here in a moment. But the true sense of these incidents is we want to be prepared and ready to actually respond. If we're not being proactive, if we're not really doing some of the other things that I'll talk here in a minute, you are going to be in this reactionary mode. And I can tell you from years of experience of being in ops and having to be the sole person on call for years, too much extended sort of behavior of this reactionary sort of urgency is very, very hard on people. And so that's not a humane, way to approach on call. And if you start talking about large scale systems, complex systems, things that really, really must maintain maximum uptime, you have to take a different approach on your people, because you're going to burn them out, and it's just never going to really work out the way you think it will. So we've got the response phase, and then that leads into the remediation phase, where we're actually starting to do some work that's bringing the system services back up, and then hopefully we'll resolve that incident and then move on to the analysis phase. And this one, to me, is probably the most important, because so many people, so many teams and organizations don't take the time to dig in and really analyze what happened. And I'm not talking about a root cause analysis. I'm not talking about getting into the technical specifics of what broke and all that kind of stuff. That is for sure information that we should allow to surface in our analysis. But what I really want to know is, how can I shorten the time for the other phases preceding this? How can I make it so that it is able to detect sooner, and that our system is able to now respond sooner? And when I say system, I mean socio-technical systems, the people part of the system as well. How can we get the response shortened? How can we get the remediation shortened? The answers to those questions are in the analysis. When you start to actually ask, why did it make sense for us to do this way under these circumstances? That's a far more important question than asking why something failed exactly in a very root cause analysis type of way. So I like to use terms like post-incident review. Post-mortem's not too bad, but the point is, we're not trying to necessarily drill down to a causal specific thing. We just want to discuss what happened along the timeline and all of the different interesting things and the decisions that were made, and really get to the core of why we thought those decisions were the right thing to do. And what that allows us to do is have these conversations that sets us up for the next phase, where we're now preparing and we're in this like readiness posture. If you think about a fire engine crew, they've always got all of their gear ready to go, and the trucks are facing the door, and as soon as there's an alarm, they are out and they are swarming to the problem. We have to take that same approach when it comes to our systems and dealing with the outages. We have to be prepared, we have to be ready to go, and a lot of that gets set up in the preceding phases of the incident. What you learn through detection, response, remediation all gets uncovered in analysis and gets fed right back into the readiness, and you just kind of keep going through it. And this all kind of falls back onto how failure is just normal within the systems that we're building now. So we have to kind of look at it different. Like I said, one of the main things that I advocate and really harp on people is you have to take a different posture, in that we are not reacting to outages, we are responding to outages. And I know that seems very sort of subtle, but it's a big deal when you start to actually realize we are being proactive about this. This doesn't have to suck. This doesn't have to be a terrible experience, because we're kind of prepared. We have run books in place. We have, within VictorOps, there's some automation that allows you to, right within the incident itself, see a Grafana dashboard. That cuts down on so much, cognitive load that initial first responder has to deal with. These are the things that really make a difference when you start kind of taking a more proactive approach. And there's lots of other things too that we kind of talk about at VictorOps in terms of how you can make the on-call experience a lot more humane. Well, the first one is, let's make it official, like who's on call, who's responsible for what time of day, which days of the week. How many days a month? Let's get really some rigor around what is our on-call sort of experience and our process and the way we want to sort of address problems within our systems. So setting up teams, setting up rotations, who's responsible for that, setting up the way that you like things to be escalated. Everybody's got a different approach, but being able to go in and say, well, if Jason is paged but he doesn't respond within, I don't know, a minute or so, we want it to then go on to the next person. Being able to have that kind of flexibility and allow the systems to sort of work through the best sort of case path to get things remediated, that's going to make life so much easier for the responders when they don't have to think about all that kind of stuff. And if they're not, for whatever reason, able to respond, you have confidence that the system is going to roll over to the next person. Excuse me. Also, like, what kind of rules should be in place when these alerts come in? Do you want something to automatically trigger? Would you like a webhook to maybe go kick off another application or service? Maybe you've got some other external applications that need to receive some additional information, or maybe they're going to run some other execution. You can have all that kind of automated, which again lessens the load for those first responders, especially for some of the very simple tasks. If a service has been maybe stopped for whatever reason, rather than paging a person immediately, why don't we just go ahead and try seeing if we can run a script or have one of our chat bots take care of it. Chat ops is kind of a fun topic that I think a lot of companies are starting to look into, where we're just moving some of the commands that we would normally do in a command line interface in our terminal, and we're putting that into chat and letting a chat bot actually execute it for us. And that's cutting down on us having to run the command in our terminal, but then also communicate to the team within our group chat or within VictorOps what it is you actually do, or what you did to try to fix the problem. You can kind of just share basically your terminal and show people what you're doing within Slack or whatever your favorite chat program is. But the point of all this is that being able to communicate, what's going on, who's doing what the results are super, super important when it comes to actually reducing the time it takes to respond and remediate. And that may involve getting people on a call. It may just involve having conversations, very verbose conversations within chat of, hey, I'm looking at the logs. This is what I saw in the logs. Okay, now I'm over in Grafana and this is what I'm seeing here. Maybe dropping a snapshot of that picture from Grafana into chat so that everybody has the same awareness. That's the type of communication that you see with companies that are really able to increase their uptime and also be able to constantly just provide new features and new functionality. They're very good at communicating under these circumstances, and the reason is they've prepared for it. They're ready. And then like I said, the learning and improving part I think is my favorite, because it seems like it's just a gold mine for a lot of folks. And as soon as they realize that they can just spend maybe an hour after a significant incident or even a smaller minor outage, just kind of digging into some of the details and the data of what it's like to be on call for this service or for our company in general, you're going to uncover so many areas that you can improve. You're going to find that people are definitely being on call way too long. Of course, their response times are starting to drop. This person has been paged maybe 10 times in the past 3 nights. That's a lot. And sometimes you don't have visibility on that. And especially if you have really noisy systems, this can get out of control if you're not keeping an eye on it. So always be looking for ways to really uncover the reality of what it's like to be on call for your system. And that's going to, again, open up all kinds of areas for improvement. Another sort of topic that I talk a lot about, which I've already touched on, is those post-incident reviews. That's part of the learning stuff. In fact, a post-incident review is itself a learning review, where we go through, and again, it kind of goes back to let's divorce ourselves from any notion of root cause. Let's just talk about what happened and see if we can shorten the time it takes for us to detect issues like this. Because I don't know that we can actually prevent this specific problem from happening again. And even if we could, there's going to be another one right behind it that we didn't see coming, because again, our systems are complex and unknown. So why don't we just make it so that we're very, very good about knowing a problem is either about to happen or is actively happening, and then get very good at responding to that problem, because that's really our sort of our best effort is to know about these problems sooner and respond to them sooner. And you can dig into all these things simply by just having a discussion about what really took place during the incident. So kind of coming to close here, I want to just wrap up with a few other things. We've talked about a lot of stuff. We've given you a little bit of a sort of intro to several different tools here. We've talked about sort of the site reliability mindset and what we're trying to accomplish and how it sort of relates back to DevOps. But one of the things that I think often slips through the cracks a lot of times in different webinars that I've given is when it comes to DevOps, there's still a lot of folks out there that really just bias towards the technology and the process of DevOps, and they forget about the people part. And I think a lot of what we're trying to show here today is that when it comes to reliability of a service, yes, there's a tool chain that you build, but it still comes down to that we're thinking more in terms of the business itself and how do we bring more value to the business. So I kind of want to leave with this. This is sort of my own personal definition of DevOps. Of course, there's a billion of them out there, but I like to say that DevOps is really no longer simply about getting developers and operations together, which it really was never meant to be just that in the first place. But what it's actually meant to do is give us or allow us to have an approach to our work where we continuously look for methods to evaluate and improve all three of the technology, process, and people as they relate to building, deploying, operating, securing, and supporting the value. And it's important that we say value here, or we at least recognize that term. Not necessarily supporting the application or the service. Of course, that is the value, but you have to think in a little bit larger terms because that's just what the business is more concerned with. And you'll get more buy-in on a lot of this stuff when it comes to the efforts you're going to have to request to even implement some of this tool chain. So I guess my piece of advice here is that you can tell the story back to other members of your organization and your team when you show them how you're delivering value. It's not simply about adding new tools to your tool chain. It's not simply about experimenting with new processes. You're really just you're solely dedicated to driving more value to the business, and that's going to open up all kinds of doors to allow you to do some of these new things. And at the end of the day, if you really stop and think about it, all this is just continuous improvement. Across the board continuous improvement. We do not really like the term best practices anymore. I think it's fine to use language like current thinking or current practices, but things are just evolving so quickly. We have to stop assuming or believing that there is a right way, a wrong way, or a silver bullet to solving these problems. It's really different for each of us in our own businesses and the services and the values that we're trying to deliver. But if we all have this, sort of posture of we're always looking for ways to improve, most of the things that people talk about with DevOps, like in terms of continuous deployment and reduced time to resolve, those end up just being byproducts. So rather than them being the goal, they're just sort of the thing that happens because you focused more on continuous improvement. So I'm going to leave you with that. If you'd like to learn more about all of our different tools here, we've got some links for you. You can go download and check out a bunch of the InfluxData stuff over at influxdata.com/download. Leonard gave you a link earlier about their Play Grafana site that you can go and kind of test out an already running live site. But if you want to go get Grafana set up yourself, there's the address for that, grafana.com/get. And then, of course, VictorOps, it's always free to try for a couple of weeks. So if you go to try.victorops.com/trial, you can get in there and start integrating in Grafana and see what it looks like when some of those notifications go off and how you can kind of play with automating what the responder is going to see to, again, let's make it easier for them. It's a very kind of high stress role to be tasked with keeping up time and constantly innovating. So we're always looking for ways to improve that experience. So try it out and let us know what you think across the board on all of our tools. We're all welcome to, or we all welcome more feedback. And then one other thing I'll say, a lot of the stuff that we touched on today, I know we went through it really quickly just because of the time that we had. But I wrote a book earlier this year on site reliability engineering, and it's not a how-to. It's not this is what you're supposed to do to achieve site reliability engineering in any way. What it is it's more of a chronicle of what we did at VictorOps. Over the course of a year, I sort of documented the entire conversation, all of the meetings we had, the questions that came up, the answers that came from those, the follow-up questions, and it all comes to the very end of the book ends with our very first chaos engineering experiment, which is really designed to expose more unknowns of our system. So it was kind of a fun project to really kind of keep tabs on what VictorOps was doing throughout this whole thing and document it and now share that with others. And hopefully there's some things that you might be able to learn from that story. So download that book and let me know what you think. But other than that, I think maybe we can hand it back over and see what kind of questions we got.
Yeah, well, unfortunately, we're at the top of the hour, so we're not going to have any time for questions. But I do want to thank our panelists today, Margot Shadell, Jason Hand, and Leonard Graham for joining me today. And if you do have a question for any of our panelists, feel free to follow up with any of them. I'm sure they'd be more than happy to hear from you. Also, just a reminder, today's event has been recorded, so if you missed any of the event, you will be able to access it on demand. You'll be receiving a link in an email that will take you right to the webinar. You can also check it out on DevOps.com. It will be living there as well, so feel free to check out DevOps.com for that webinar and also other webinars that we have both coming and that are on demand. But again, thank you all for joining me today. Thanks to our panelists for giving such a great presentation. And this is Charlene O'Hanlon, and I'm signing off. Have a great day, everybody.